on carnivore diets, you're much less likely to blow your money on expensive goods. Our economy is founded on hedonic consumption. A carnivore diet is very threatening to the status quo. There was a study released earlier this year. Consumers, when they're loaded with caffeine, they're much more likely to give into addiction, namely impulsivity. This could help make more profits for corporations. With that said, I don't think it's any coincidence that a corporation like Target has a Starbucks at the entrance. I had to get a PhD in marketing to become the anti-marketer. I think I'm actually the first and only person to integrate a carnivore diet into marketing.
So today we have Ash as our featured guest. Ash has been in the community for quite some time now. So we're going to talk about what he does, I guess. Ash, you're located, I believe, in Pennsylvania. Is that correct?
Correct. I'm in Scranton, Pennsylvania, home of the office.
And tell us, for those, maybe not know what you do, or particular people listening on YouTube, what is it that you do? And we can get started talking about some stuff.
Okay. For the record, my name is Dr. Ash Zareian. I'm a professor and consumer researcher at the University of Scranton. And I study narcissistic consumption, which includes addiction and character disorders such as narcissism. As a professor, I teach principles of marketing, international marketing, sustainability, and research methods.
I haven't heard, of course, we're all have heard a lot about narcissism in the last few years. It's become a popular thing to talk about, and some people use it as a slur. But let me ask you, what is narcissistic consumption? What does that mean? I hadn't heard that term before.
Narcissistic consumption is a type of consumption that's driven by narcissism.
Okay, well, that makes sense. But what is it? How would that show up? What would that mean? We all consume things.
Right. Specifically, this would show up as buying fancy, expensive products, addiction, even. So wherever there's addiction, there's narcissism, and wherever there's narcissism, there's probably addiction.
So this would be like a super fancy sports car, the nicest clothes and super watches and all that stuff, that type of stuff.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I know you'd been doing some research within the carnivore community around addiction. Is that research ready for prime time yet? Is that something we're going to be able to discuss today, or no?
Yeah, no, we're going to be able to talk about it.
Perfect.
I haven't published it yet, but we can definitely talk about some of the fascinating results that I think is not only beneficial to the community, but definitely beneficial to the world. So I think it's really important to get this information out there to the people, even though there's been no publications on it. And so, yeah, we can start there.
Obviously, there's a lot of publications on addiction. There's journals of addiction and stuff like that. So, but as far as utilizing a carnivore diet, so I know you were collecting data from people that were on a carnivore diet and wanted to see how it impacted addiction. So let's get into that, if you don't mind. Tell us what you got.
First of all, Shawn, I would like to thank you, because I couldn't have completed this study without you nor the community. So to everyone who participated or tried to get the study out there, thank you so much.
Well, and that's really a small, I don't deserve any. It's just a small task to say, hey guys, can you help? That's pretty easy to do. So I didn't do much, so I don't want to take any credit. But thanks for doing it. So anyway, let's talk about what you found.
So I collected about 41 samples of carnivores who've been eating this way for about 6 months, and I took about 33 respondents on a standard American diet. And I compared their scores on narcissism and addiction. And those who ate carnivorously scored significantly lower on narcissism and addiction. And that's huge, because it's very difficult to manage both narcissism and addiction.
I guess the question I would say is, how is that validated? Is there some sort of clinically validated narcissism and addiction scale that you would compare this to?
I'm sorry, Shawn, you cut out. Can you repeat that question, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was asking, the clinical validation of this sort of survey. Is there a standardized addiction model, narcissism model that you utilize? What is that? What is that model that you compare it to?
I used 2 scales. One was from Aaron Pincus, and the other one was a really popular narcissism scale that's been used in the 80s by Raskin and Hall. And as far as the addiction scale, I took the Yale addiction food scale, and I adopted and adapted the items to fit general addiction.
How, I'm just wondering, particularly when it comes to food consumption, I mean, can you tell by what you're eating if you're narcissistic, or is it just, I mean, I assume you're looking at other narcissistic qualities and it just happened. I mean, like one's food doesn't indicate, I mean, can you eat in a way that's narcissistic? I mean, some people say, hey, you're eating friggin' ribeye steaks and fillets every day. That's a pretentious, showy type of thing. And maybe that's narcissistic. So how does it work with relation to food? Does it just say these are narcissistic traits and these are the people that have them maybe?
I would say it's not necessarily the food per se, but it's the relationship to the food. If you're indulging, not really, you're overeating, perhaps you're not feeling satisfied. You're eating to kill pain. So narcissism and addiction are both about chronic pain.
Interesting.
And so, it's more so about the relationship with the food than anything.
Than the actual food itself. Yeah, that makes better sense to me. Yeah. And so like how much of a discrepancy was there? Was this like a, 3% difference? Was it a pretty significant margin of difference?
It was very, very significant. I can't tell you in terms of the percentages, but in terms of the probability, I mean, it was huge. So, I mean, as far as validating this scientifically, looking at the theory, well, first of all, we can't necessarily understand addiction or narcissism without placing it in its historical context.
Okay.
So, historically, narcissism has always been associated with addiction, and this is a knowledge, if you will, that's been lost. I think any modern scientist, watching this video right now might say that, hey, this is weird, linking narcissism to addiction. Historically, different cultures, such as Native American cultures and even Tibetan and Indian cultures, have linked narcissism with addiction.
So I mean, I guess you would say there's a higher percentage of, say, drug addicts, cocaine users and stuff like that would be narcissistic. Does that
Correct.
hold up?
Correct. I mean, if you look at the origins of narcissism and addiction, they both have their roots in childhood trauma. Scholars have said they're both very, very difficult to treat. They're both symbolically childish. And, reading the literature side by side, I felt like before I even knew it, I was studying the same thing. And so, and not only that, when we're in our addiction, Shawn, we're elevating the act of consumption over our relationships, which in itself is very narcissistic.
Let me ask you just about narcissism, because a lot of people would equate narcissism with somebody that's like super successful and, that type of stuff. But are there people that are not successful that are narcissistic? Is that a misconception? What my preconceived notion what a narcissistic person would be, you often see these hyper successful people that are obviously they've got the fancy cars and all that stuff, but can you see it in the not so successful people?
Absolutely. I think as a society, we have a really misunderstood frame of reference. I mean, going back to the word narcissism itself comes from Ovid's Narcissus, meaning the character who died looking at himself in his own reflection.
Right.
Narcissism is more about fragility. It's more about childishness. It's more about emotional instability. And by emotional instability, I mean lower emotions such as shame, guilt, apathy, depression, anger, pride, desire.
What is, it's kind of interesting because, you've been around long enough and I've been around plenty long enough to see a lot of people resolve a number of mental health issues. We've got, guys like Brett in here who's cured himself a lifetime of significant depressive disorders and all kinds of other things. Do you think narcissism can be treated with nutrition? I know Chris Palmer has been talking about bipolar and all this stuff. Is this something that's treatable with nutrition?
Yeah, I think you'll love this, Shawn. I mean, first of all, we talked about treating bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and even autism with the carnivore diet. And I think the only thing we haven't really talked about is treating narcissism with a carnivore diet. Interestingly, I found this by accident, but I wouldn't necessarily call it an accident. In the 1970s, in a journal of anthropology, there's a scholar by the name of Revero, and she talked about how Native Americans would treat narcissism. So their term, the term for narcissism, comes from the Algonquin language, which is a subset of Native peoples, and they would treat what they would call narcissism. It is called either Wetiko, Wetiko, or Wendigo, which is interchangeable with Wetiko, with a high-fat carnivore diet. So these Native Americans knew something that we're just barely beginning to learn.
Where would someone go to read about that particular? That's something I haven't heard about. And I've heard a lot. I haven't read everything, but I've seen a lot of the historical texts on carnivore. Where did that come from?
There's a paper. It was I think it's called "The Nutritional Factors of Wendigo Psychosis" by Vivian Rohrl, that was published in 1970, and she talked about how Native Americans would, when one of their community members was afflicted with this, what they would call a psychic parasite, they would feed them high amounts of duck fat or high amounts of bear fat. And, I think this might be ancestral. So someone in Europe might want to eat high amounts of cow or lamb fat or something like that.
Interesting. And so just because, forgive my ignorance because I don't deal with this, but what is the standard treatment for narcissism? Is it medications? What is it? Is it behavioral therapy? What is a normal thing that people do?
Well, it's very difficult to treat. And, most psychotherapists actually don't even want to treat them. They actually give up on them. And so I took up the daunting task to see what it is that we could do as a society that to treat this I would call it a pandemic at this point. I mean, wherever there's high amounts of trauma, and we live in a what I would call a relatively traumatized society, wherever there's high amounts of trauma, there's narcissism. And so I tried to come up with as many comprehensive ways that I could to see how we could treat narcissism. So it's not just one way. I think that carnivore is one piece of the puzzle. And, you can bring a horse to water, Shawn, but you can't necessarily make them drink it. So just because you can tell someone suffering from addiction to go on a carnivore diet doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to do so. But we need to construct conditions that are conducive toward promoting healthy treatment modalities such as carnivore. But some other ways that I found are conducive to treating this are things like gratitude. For the record, I did 3 studies to analyze how to treat this character disorder from many different angles. So another one was gratitude. Another one was forgiveness. Another one is affirmations, working with psychedelics, namely ayahuasca, and another plant medicine called ibogaine, which are incredibly powerful plant medicines.
Yeah, interesting. And I've known some people that have delved in both of those things, and they've all said it was a very powerful experience. Some good, some bad, just to be fair. Do you? So, like I said, you said that narcissism and addiction often, co-locate. They're often running together. What is why is that relationship there? Why do you think the addiction and the narcissism often run together?
Well, like I said, they both have their roots in childhood trauma. They both have, they're both characterized by a fragile personality. They're both characterized by emotional instability. And they're both characterized by childishness. So I know that more so describes it, but narcissism, when it develops in childhood, it's more so a coping mechanism. It's a response towards suffering, as is addiction. So these are individuals that are just trying to find pain relief, if anything, and so when we, anyone who has more than a superficial understanding of narcissism might say that it's associated with anger and rage and just not very good emotions that you don't want to be associated with. But philosophically speaking, if we look at anger, someone who's in rage, we would say that this person is in pain and they lash out as a way of saying, how dare you make me look at my pain? So, I mean, that it's a really interesting way to look at anger, that these people are in pain. And when they're anger, it's kind of a deflection to say that they're not willing to look at their pain yet.
Yeah, interesting. So I can imagine, like you said, there's a lot of people. I mean, if a lot of people with narcissism, maybe they don't want to be treated. I mean, maybe they're happy, and you said it's sort of you become somewhat, I guess, selfish, I suppose, and you're
right,
very much
right,
interested.
right. There's only a small window of opportunity to help people who are afflicted with narcissism. And there's a phenomena that's emerging right now that hasn't been written about. And it's at the level of only being talked about in lectures, called narcissistic collapse or collapse narcissism. And it's characterized by a really severe depression. And psychotherapists throughout the 1900s were writing about depression as a function of object loss, meaning that they lost their relationships to their friends, their jobs, their family, and so forth. And so they go a little unhinged. And so narcissism in the long term is quite unsustainable. And so they may or may not indefinitely be in a period of collapse. And maybe one day they'll just say, I can't do this anymore. And it may come down to a life or death situation in which they might seek help or they might not.
Interesting. As far as, like I've seen, certainly within this community, people that were addicts, maybe still are addicts, but have successfully weaned themselves off of those substances, whether it be alcohol, cigarette smoking, recreational drugs, food addiction, which I think certainly exists. I mean, we see that very clearly with a carnivore type of diet. Do you think there's something within the standard American diet that is contributing to both addiction and some of these other behavioral disorders that we're seeing more frequently?
Absolutely. The most powerful theory in the addiction research, Shawn, is something called dislocation theory. Dislocation theory is when individuals get removed from their families, they get disconnected from the land, they get disconnected from their traditional diets, and ultimately, as a consequence, they get disconnected from themselves. So I think it's important to, for the sake of this conversation, to talk about disconnection from traditional diet. If we are of the strong conviction that carnivore diets are the authentic ancestral diets, then it's connecting people back with the way they're supposed to eat to really transmute and to transcend both narcissism and addiction.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it depends how far back you go. You talk about ancestral diets, so we can look at like you mentioned, Native Americans and some of these other more recent converts to the Western diet, which has been, we've seen that, within a few generations. Whereas, many of us, like right now, you see 3 or 4 generations of people that have been eating garbage. They've been eating garbage since the 1950s. And so they individually haven't been disconnected. They ate what their parents ate, which is still garbage. But so you're saying it's broader than that. It goes back to thousands of years, if longer. Is that where I'm getting?
That's correct. I don't think it's a coincidence that when we see the interviews, which I would classify as qualitative research of what you're doing, Shawn, which is incredibly important. And it is what you're doing with these interviews is science. And it's no coincidence that these individuals are getting off of cigarettes, alcohol, even pornography for that matter.
Yeah, I see that. I see that very frequently with these folks, and I thought that's quite interesting. I'm sure you're familiar with Chris Palmer's work. Then he's doing some of the stuff with ketogenic diets, carnivore diets, and bipolar disorder, and so on and so forth. So with this research and that you've completed, obviously the next step would be to submit for publication. Do you know where you're going to do that at yet?
I'm aiming for the Journal of Consumer Psychology, if I'm lucky. I kind of want to reach out to a few other scholars and have them review my paper, or maybe strengthen my literature review. But I have enough data and enough theory to really come forward and at least get the ball rolling when it comes to discussing possibly treating a really difficult character disorder such as narcissism.
Yeah, I mean, just because some of us have like you said, a very superficial understanding. Can you sort of outline a typical narcissist, who maybe a public person we would know, or something like that, or you could just define those characteristics and traits?
Sure. Typically anyone who runs for president. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that.
Because their need for a position of power speaks to a need for admiration, to be able to validate themselves because they feel unworthy. Narcissists often put up this front of that they're a big shot, that they have all this self-confidence, but it's just the front. At the end of the day, they're actually quite vulnerable and quite fragile.
Well, somebody's got to run for president, though. I mean, I guess. I mean, I think pretty much every country in the world has somebody that's the leader or the ruler. Somebody's got to do it. So, by definition, does that person have to be a narcissist to do it? I mean, can you have some good ones?
No, not necessarily. However, it's been written about that narcissistic traits are actually quite prized. And if we do want leaders of our communities and of our nations, then we would want very narcissistic individuals to do so.
So you're saying we should have somebody who has a mental illness to lead us. That's kind of an interesting concept. I mean, I can see where, you often see like world champions of whatever, they're single-mindedly focused or obsessed. They sometimes have these obsessive, very, very, focused traits. And a lot of these people that have been very successful, these geniuses, are just able to sort of, just focus on one task with all their might, and then everything else is. So maybe you need some of those people in the world to sort of be exceptional, I suppose. But then again, it can backfire on that person, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if you're a person who's afflicted by narcissism, we always focus on the bad qualities of it, but not necessarily, not all the time. I mean, I think I've been researching narcissism for almost 7 years now, at the PhD level. And, for whatever reason, it seems to go for people who are gifted in some kind of way. It goes for the beautiful. It goes for the intelligent. It goes for the funny. It goes for the athletic. It goes for the talented. If you look at Islamic conceptualizations of narcissism, they've associated narcissism with jinn, and this is a bit of a folklore. This isn't science, but they said that usually this demon, of which they call jinn, looks for highly prized characteristics and it possesses them. So, but that's just spiritual folklore, and narcissism in many historical traditions has been characterized by spirituality. So from Native American cultures to even Tibetan cultures, in Tibetan cultures, they've called narcissism the hungry ghost, and we've only recently gotten transcriptions of ancient text very recently, there's a professor named Andy Rotman at Smith College, and he recently got a hold of some texts and translated all of these historical texts into a book about hungry ghosts. And they're described quite poetically that I think are very fitting to today's society. I mean, some phrases come to mind that they're very emaciated, that they don't have any muscle, and they have these bellies the size of mountains, and they're perpetual cremations to speak to the amount of pain they're in, which describes those who are on unhealthy diets. Constantly bloating. I mean, bloating historically has been associated with narcissism. That's really interesting.
Danny asked a question about how do you differentiate between someone who's narcissistic and somebody who's just confident, and, like I said, confidence is often considered a good trait, or it can be a good trait. I think about an athlete preparing for a competition. If you're self-doubting, then you're likely going to perform well. How do we distinguish between the two?
Like I said, someone claiming out there that, that they're confident, but deep down they're thinking they're worthless. I think that that contrast would be narcissistic. However, a person who expresses outward confidence as well as inner confidence, I think this is a healthy confidence. I mean, I really like Brett's definition of confidence. He says that when you're on a carnivore diet, you exude this quiet confidence, and I don't think he could be any further from the truth. So.
Yeah, some are less quiet about it than others.
but Shawn, that's not to say that this is a panacea.
Yeah.
Native Americans were very concerned about when narcissism becomes full blown, in which I would equate to psychopathy. When it becomes full blown, high fat carnivore diets wouldn't work for them. So they would have to isolate the community member and give them a high fat diet before it got any worse. So people who, maybe practice forgiveness or try to practice gratitude or go on a high fat carnivore diet, and it's not working for them, they might be far gone. Then that might be the unfortunate reality of it.
Yeah. Interesting. As far as, your interest, well, let me go back, just your own personal sort of thing. How did you get interested in a carnivore diet in the first place? I know you just kind of popped up one day. I can't remember everybody's story, but I know you've been here for a year plus at least, attending these meetings. What drove, was an interest from a psychological aspect, or was it something else that got you interested?
I was experiencing a lot of guilt over the way animals were treated. And I was fooled, like a lot of us, into thinking that red meat caused cancer and heart disease and constipation. And I've been suffering from an irritable bowel ever since I could remember, and skin disorders as well. And there wasn't a lot of information. And I think if I even found out about a carnivore diet as a kid, I don't think my parents would have let me do it. I mean, they still think I'm insane now. But going into this, I was a vegan, and I was very dogmatic and purist and crazy. And it got really bad to where I had to have surgery, and I was having complications from the surgery, and those complications were from fiber. And so the more vegan I became, the sicker I got. And I think I just was so desperate. I was just eating natto, nutritional yeast, cucumbers, tomato, and a little bit of grape. And I'm 5'8", and I weighed 113 pounds. And my doctor was wise enough to try to convince me to eat meat. And he said, meat doesn't cause cancer. Meat doesn't cause heart disease. Vegans get cancer too. Mm-hmm. But I was still narrow-minded, and I didn't want to listen to him. But that same week, I got really desperate, and because whatever I wasn't doing, whatever I was doing wasn't working, and I was just incredibly bloated. Even though I wasn't eating well, I was, pretty athletic in the sense that I was doing 8-9 miles a day and going to the gym every day, and I just wasn't gaining muscle. And I think in this desperation, I came across your podcast with Joe Rogan, and as soon as I heard, all like I heard you say, and this was 3 years ago, over 3 years ago. So I'm paraphrasing, something like, very often we'll find corn in our stool, but how often do you find a piece of meat in your stool? And as soon as I heard that, I was sold. And the very next day was Easter Sunday, and I went out, and not many places were open except this one grocery store. And I went out and I bought a steak, and my IBS was cured in a day. And I never looked back, but that wasn't to say that I was still struggling. I mean, it's been a learning experience. Even now, I recently discovered that I'm quite sensitive to beef, and I can only eat lamb. So this diet is extra difficult for me, and it doesn't help that within the last year or so, lamb prices have risen 21.4%. So.
Yeah, most of what we have in the U.S. is imported, by the way. Let me ask you, because the obvious question would be, well, if a high-fat carnivore diet seems to be associated with lower, potentially curative for narcissism, or at least a treatment for narcissism and a lower incidence, what about the opposite? Is there any research on veganism and narcissism? Would there be a higher percentage of people that are narcissistic that are vegan or addicted, perhaps?
Well, given the fact that vegans look like hungry ghosts, they're emaciated and they have these big bloated bellies. They kind of speak to the text here. There hasn't been much research, but anecdotally speaking, if you look at a lot of these videos, look at the amount of rage and dogma. I would go to these forums and I would try to incorporate certain foods, and I would just get accosted, and you go to the opposite community and you try to reincorporate foods, and it's not perfect, but mostly everyone is trying to help you. So, anecdotally speaking, that speaks to the association of veganism. And if you look at veganism from a theoretical standpoint of dislocation theory, no one has ever been vegan. One of the constituents of dislocation theory is having a connection to the family, and I believe that if we have strong roots in our family and we try to go vegan, our grandmothers wouldn't let us. You know what I mean? They'd say, "Hey, what are you doing? Don't be stupid. We've been eating meat." And so that's probably to say that vegans don't really have strong family roots. But I don't want to sit here and bash vegans, because a lot of carnivores are ex-vegans, including myself. So however, going on a carnivore diet where the brain fog lifts and the depression lifts, you have this equanimity. It probably balances you out to where you can rejuvenate your relationships and make amends. And this kind of speaks to the 12 steps. And we can see how this is kind of akin to addiction.
Yeah, I've literally now seen thousands of vegan to carnivore transformations. You rarely see, if ever, the other way, which is kind of interesting. But do you, as far as the your day to day, so you're strictly in academics. Are you dealing with a lot of people with these things, or is this all more theoretical stuff that you're seeing? Do you actually run into clients and patients and things like that?
Well, I'm a professor. What I notice is hopelessness. I think among I mean, I've been in academia for around 6 years, and I think just the trauma of COVID and being isolated and, a staggering economy has kind of afflicted the collective with a sort of despair. And I mean, especially the younger populations. So I haven't been as worried. I tend not to worry. I try not to. I mean, I try to stay optimistic, because I mean, pessimism can even be a function of narcissism, believe it or not. And so I try to catch myself and be hopeful, because the word is very powerful. And I don't know if you know this, Shawn, but I'm actually the meditation host of this community, and I have been for a year and a half. And so every Thursday, recently I had to change my schedule from Friday to Thursday. So I have meditations here in the community at 3 p.m. Eastern time on Thursday, if anyone's interested. And even at the beginning of my class, I host a 2 to 3 minute meditation. And I've been meditating for 6 years, and I was struggling with a very hardcore drug addiction in 2015, and I got very desperate, and like coming across the miracle of your podcast with Joe Rogan, Shawn, I came across a video, and it was the only instructional video in early 2016 on meditation. And I started meditating, and I got rid of some of the harder addictions I'd been struggling with for a couple of years. However, I was still battling alcoholism later on. I was still battling an addiction to smoking later on, in which I went to South America and I started working with ayahuasca. And it was just an absolute blessing to work with this medicine. And most people are under the impression that ayahuasca heals people, but rather it gives you the insight you need to heal yourself. So in that regard, ayahuasca is a revealer, not a healer. And ayahuasca is one of the strongest, if not the strongest, plant medicine in the world that I am aware of. People with autoimmune issues such as MS, arthritis, Lyme disease, even cancer, they go and stay in the jungle for maybe 3 weeks at a time, or intermittently they go to a retreat once a year, and they get over their cancer, and they get over their addictions. And for me, I was struggling with very severe addiction. The first time I went, I was struggling with an addiction to prescription medication and to cannabis. And the first time I went, I got off the prescription medication, but I still struggled with the cannabis. But one of the insights I received, and this is ironic because it's coming from a plant medicine, was telling me how to fix my diet. And it was telling me, Ash, you're a carnivore. You can only eat meat. It's weird. The ayahuasca experience is very strange. I mean, you go into this subliminally trance-like state where you're receiving insight, and it's just these intuitive downloads, if you will. And you're like, okay, I have to do this, I have to do this, and I have to do this once I get home. So one of the things I downloaded from this experience was that I'm a carnivore and I can only drink water. And that's ironic because this is coming from a plant, and that's so strange. And so, when you get home, it's like things aren't fixed for you. And so you do have doubts. So I'd be like, no, I'm not going to believe that. And then I would try something that was a plant and I would get sick. And so, I'd be like, wow. Or I would drink something that wasn't water, like a mineral tea, just something as innocent as a tea with minerals in it. Something called Shilajit, which my co-host Becky is a big fan of. And my sinuses would get congested. So it was insights like this that were very helpful toward me transcending addiction, and I've been clean ever since. And so,
first of all, congratulations on that. And I, like I said, I know I just did an interview with a guy named Brian Rose, who hosts this podcast called London Real, and he's done ayahuasca, and Pete Evans has done that. And so I'm aware of several people now that have done it. They've also just been fairly life-changing for them. Let me ask you just a little bit more. Because I don't think maybe you can do it in the U.S. I don't know. There might be a few locations in the U.S., but most people go down to South America, Mexico, I think. What is that? I mean, do you meet with somebody? What is the exact procedure that happens, if you can describe that, if you can remember?
Well, you have to meet with a highly trained shaman, in which we call ayahuasqueros. And traditionally, they originate from the Shipibo people, which there are about 24,000 of them left in South America. They're an indigenous people, and they have this incredible wisdom that we do not. I mean, they are by far some of the best doctors I've ever met in my entire life, and their training is crazy. I mean, we think medical school is crazy, but their training takes up to 10 years, and they have to do these really, really strict plant dietas, which is a traditional diet, which is not a traditional diet, but they have to isolate themselves for several months, even over a year at a time, and they can only eat one plant to learn sort of insights. There's this one plant called Camalonga in which they have to diet, and so they sit in isolation and they work with this. It's not an indigenous plant. I believe it originates in Asia, and they diet this plant, and it teaches them about the nature of disease. And then once a day, they can only eat a small serving of a little bit of rice, an unripened plantain, and a little bit of fish with no salt, and a little small cup of water. And they do this from anywhere from 6 months to 20 months at a time. And so, and very often they have to drink ayahuasca alone in the middle of the jungle. And I can tell you, Shawn, drinking ayahuasca in a group setting where you're safe is the most terrifying thing I've ever done. So I can't even imagine drinking ayahuasca alone in the jungle several nights in a row. I mean, this is what their training is like. And so my heart goes out to these people, because these people save lives. And they're very interesting, and the way they look at medicine is not like ours. It's not like Western medicine where we separate mind and body. They look at mind and body as one, and so this goes back to ancient wisdom of Buddhism for over 1,000 years. That a Buddhist precept is that you cannot separate the mind and body. And so wherever there's afflictions of the body, there's an affliction of the mind. And wherever there's an affliction of the mind, there's also an affliction in the body. And it's a very interesting and unique way of looking at medicine.
It's interesting with things like ayahuasca and some of the other psychedelics. I had a guy named Dr. Gary Schleifer on a while ago, or Schleifer, I'm not sure how Gary pronounces it, but talking about kind of the neuroplasticity and some of the sort of the almost permanent shifts that occur. Because you talk about if you have this severe traumatic event in your life, it doesn't wear off in a day like a drug. And normally we're used to taking a pill and where it's got a duration of action 6 hours and it's gone. Then we take another pill. But these traumatic events, and I guess maybe these ayahuasca ceremonies, have these long-lasting, profound impacts on our brain physiology, I assume. Is there anybody that knows what's going on there? Does anybody looked at it and say, this is what's happening to this part of the brain? I mean, are you aware of any of that stuff?
I'm not a neuroscientist, but some of the studies have really spoken to how ayahuasca changes the brain plasticity drastically. I mean, even in my own research, those who drank ayahuasca significantly scored lower narcissism. So, which is huge, but some do get worse. Don't get me wrong. I do not know why some get better and some get worse. Perhaps it has to do with one's intention. So if you're lucky enough to go to a retreat, I mean, one of the biggest themes there from day one, you might go there for 5, 7 days, maybe even 2 weeks at a time. And from day one, they have you focusing on an intention. And so if your intention is not pure, it can make you worse.
Yeah, it's interesting to think, that you could be worse from this experience, and so maybe you don't. I mean, I guess there's ways to sort of shore up your bet so it doesn't, perhaps. Um, do you? So as far as so you've got this study completed. Well, you've got the data. I assume it's written. You've got to publish it. Are you planning on doing further research in this area, or what are your next sort of moves? I suppose.
Um, I think to treat, difficulties such as addiction, narcissism, things like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, and just, all of these are, very similar in the sense that they're developmental trauma disorders. We need very holistic and comprehensive approaches. I know this is anecdotal, but idealistically speaking, I think we'd have to have, people doing sauna, cold plunges, grounding, hence being connected to the land when it comes to dislocation theory, making amends, practicing forgiveness, gratitude. I mean, especially for a beginner carnivore, even, a veteran carnivore, say thank you to the animal's life before and after your meal. That's some very good advice. I mean, that's something Native Americans have been doing when they hunted buffalo. Meditate, practice compassion, be kind, perform acts of charity, be in community, eat a steak. So,
Or better,
yeah,
eat a steak together. I think that's also a nice thing. You share a meal with someone or a group.
yeah. So I think these little practices, summed up, every day over time, just creates very, very healthy individuals. I mean, even lifting weights, going for walks, that kind of thing. I mean, I think the things I've mentioned so far, there are a lot of people who don't even practice one of those things. So, I don't even practice all of them, but I can't even imagine how good I would feel, or how good we would all feel if we were able to do all those things. So, I mean, not everyone has the luxury of going into a sauna or a cold plunge. And a lot of us live in cities where it's even difficult to put our feet in the grass. And a lot of us live on the opposite sides of the country from our families. So either way, try to have strong relationships. If you had falling outs, reach out, make amends. And I mean, this is really akin and reflective of 12-step recovery programs. So,
yeah, I think that all those things are I think good advice. And as you're right, you can't do them all, but I mean, you got to find some things that work into your day. Like I've never been much for meditating. I think I experimented with a period of time, and it just, I don't know. I guess didn't want to sit still long enough to do it, I suppose. But I have a lot of other things that I'm doing that are potentially beneficial, and you can always add more, I suppose. So with your, interest in a carnivore diet, I mean, I guess you're at a University of Scranton. Are there anybody, like when you talk to your colleagues, your peers in the department and say, hey, look, I'm doing research on carnivore diets and narcissism. Are they like, well, you're nuts, or what do they say about that?
Yeah. Most people think I'm crazy. I'm teaching sustainability, and I try to take advantage of the class to talk about a carnivore diet. I mean, last year I had Nicolette Hahn-Nyman come in and talk about beef, and I had Gabe Brown. So I have both their books on an assigned reading, because I think it's really important to talk about this. And, I don't want to be dogmatic in the sense that I force my students on a carnivore diet, but I at least try to be gentle enough to say, hey, at least eat whole foods and have an animal-based foundation. So the majority of our food volume should be coming from animal-based sources. And so we spend a significant time talking about this. And by the end of the semester, some of these kids have subscriptions to Butcher Box.
Well, and many of them probably came in. I know I was talking to a kid yesterday, he's an 18-year-old kid going to UCLA, and he's like, 25% of my high school class was on a vegan diet, and most of the kids were on antidepressants or some other ADHD meds and stuff like that. So you see this, the prevalence of this poor diet. If you're not on a vegan diet, you're on a standard American diet, both of which are suboptimal in my view, and a combination of some kind of psychiatric medication. That's not a good combo for a whole generation to be there. Are you seeing a lot of that? Are you seeing a lot of, like, when the kids roll in? I don't know what grade, how far they are in their training. Are they freshman, sophomore? Are they rolling in with all these issues?
I teach mostly juniors and seniors. Mm-hmm. They're kind. I mean, they're very reserved for the most part. But I think that's because people don't try to get to know them on a personal level or even care to, and that probably speaks to how narcissistic our society has become. But I think it's important to be seen and heard, and I try to make sure my students are seen and heard. And when I set up those conditions for my students, I think I have a lot more clout in influencing their behavior. So I mean, I make it a point to talk about a carnivore diet in all my classes because, I'm in marketing, I'm in consumer research, namely a branch called transformative consumer research, where we have to learn all about marketing to reverse the ill effects. So, I had to get a PhD in marketing to become the anti-marketer because we live in a society where we put the health of the market above the health of the people. And so, I mean, it's up to people like me to try and put the health of the people above the health of the market. And so, unfortunately, a lot of people in my field think that veganism is the way to go. I mean, in consumer research, we do have, I think I'm actually the first and only person to integrate a carnivore diet into marketing. And so another finding I found that's incredibly important, Shawn, that I didn't mention is that on carnivore diets, you're much less likely to be inclined to blow your money on expensive goods. I mean, our economy is founded on hedonic consumption. So, I mean, a carnivore diet is very threatening to the status quo. And so I think that's why, metaphorically speaking, we're starting to see Impossible burgers parked next to the actual meat on the shelves. So, there was a study released earlier this year in a top journal in Journal of Marketing that talked about how consumers, when they're loaded with caffeine, they're much more likely to give into addiction, namely impulsivity. And this could help make more profits for corporations. And with that said, I don't think it's any coincidence that a corporation like Target, for example, has a Starbucks at the entrance. So, I mean, I'm trying to shed light on some of these atrocities and protect the well-being of consumers.
Yeah, it's interesting and not surprising that, like I said, a lot of us are like, hey, I just want to make sure I have enough money to feed myself well. So I'm not going to buy that extra stuff. I think about myself. I'm still driving a 2008 truck, and I wear a t-shirt and sweatpants most of the time. So I'm definitely not blowing money on stuff that I don't necessarily need. So it's pretty interesting there. Well, unfortunately, gosh, we're running out of time. So we could keep going on this, but where can people go to find out? Well, I mean, you've got a meditation meeting here on our website at CarnivoreDiet, Revero, CarnivoreDiet. How about, do you have any social media or any of that stuff, or anything else you want to talk about or promote?
On the side, I am a musician.
Okay.
Actually, a big part of my life. I do have a music page called Arcana, ARKANA _official on Instagram. People, I mean, there are a lot of, I mean, narcissism is a really hot topic right now. And I think a lot of people traditionally, Shawn, you're the first person I've come to really talk about my research. I mean, I feel like I owe you guys that much, given that I could not have done this study without all of you. So again, thank you. And, but a lot, just when I give a hint of what I do, people really want to know this information. So you can also email me at ashzarian@gmail.com. I'm sure I'll get a lot of inquiries about, people, because there are a lot of people afflicted with addiction and plus narcissism who are just tired of it, and they want help. And and I'm here to help. So.
Well, thank you for doing that, by the way, and look forward to when it gets published, and we'll certainly promote it when it gets out there so more people have a chance to look at that. Well, anyway, thanks, Ash. I unfortunately got to run and do some consultations myself now, but the rest of you guys have a great day. I'll see you guys tomorrow. If not, have a great weekend. Thanks, Ash.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.